Well, thank you and welcome to our video conference. My name is John Hiskey. I'm advisor to the Utah League of Cities and Towns, and it's my privilege that we have today a special guest in Marie Owens, who's director of the Division of Drinking Water for the state of Utah. And with the extensive work that's taken place over this past summer, we established a very good relationship with Marie and her people, and she wanted to come out and in advance talk with municipal water suppliers relative to proposed rule changes that impact the utilization of master meters and liabilities relating to what happens after that master meter is responsible. I have probably misstated the whole comment.
Not at all. No, that's pretty much it.
That's pretty much it. But Marie, we really appreciate you and opportunity for you, and we do have the ability, as you note here, for people who are listening in to be able to speak with us, respond to questions.
Okay.
And again, we appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to thank John for setting this up. As he mentioned, we asked to be able to speak with the league and all of the membership on a topic that's come to our attention over the last couple of years. And we have been trying to resolve some concerns that public water systems, particularly public water systems that our municipalities have brought to our attention. And so we've got some suggestions, we've got something to present to you. And before we go all the way to rulemaking, we wanted to present it to you and get your feedback and get your thoughts and let you participate in this process before we begin the actual rulemaking process. So, the federal government defines what a public water system is. This is in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we have no ability to change this whatsoever. The criteria is 25 people served or 15 connections. So if you happen to have one connection that serves 25 people, that constitutes a public water system. If you have a trailer park of tiny homes and there are 16 of those tiny homes and only one person can fit into those, that's still a public water system because that would be 15 connections. So it's 25 people or 15 connections. I've got a caveat on this slide here that practically that means 8 connections here in Utah. We have, based on the census, our average population is 3.16 people per connection. So if you run the math, that means that if we have 8 connections, you have over 25 people. So 8 connections really is the cutoff point here in Utah. But the federal rule says 15 connections. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Then the other criteria is that you have to deliver water for at least 60 days a year. So if for some reason you're a public water system and you do supply water to over 25 people, but you only do that for one weekend, say it's a band festival, and you provide water for 3,000 people for 3 days, you are not a public water system. So it has to be for at least 60 days out of the year. And then it also has to be delivered for human consumption. So you're not a public water system if you're delivering water just for irrigation or for industrial use. It has to be used for public consumption. So that's a public water system. That's always been the definition and will continue to be the definition. We have 3 categories of water systems. One is a transient non-community system. So that is a public water system that has a rotating population. The examples we use here are restaurants and campgrounds. So you have a restaurant that you are serving 50 people a day, a night at your restaurant, they're different people, you're a public water system. Or a campground, different people coming in all of the time, you have more than 25 people, they are different, you're still a public water system. The next category is non-transient, non-community. So that means it's not a transient population in that they're different people all the time. So it's the same people, but it's still not a community. It's not where these people live. So examples of that would be schools. You have the same students that show up day after day after day, or a factory, or a workplace, or a church tends to have the same group of people that show up consistently. So they would be considered non-transient, non-community. And then what most of you are familiar with is a community water system. These are the ones that we traditionally think of as a public water system, in that you're delivering water to somebody's home. They live there, they drink that water day after day. It's their home, and that's a community water system. Now, in the state of Utah, we have nearly 1,000, just over 1,000 public water systems. Half of those are either transient or non-transient, non-community. The other half are community water systems. Of the half that are community water systems, half of those serve less than 500 people. So they only have to serve 25 people to be a public water system, and we have nearly 250 water systems that serve somewhere between 25 people and 500 people. That's a lot of public water systems. So that's kind of how our community or our public water systems are broken out in the state of Utah. So what are we going to be talking about today? I realized as I was driving up here that John scheduled this right before Halloween because this is a horror story, and this is your Halloween presentation from the League of Cities and Towns. So we're going to talk about the liability that a public water system, and particularly a city or a municipality, has had ever since the Safe Drinking Water Act was enacted back in the 70s. So this is not new, and as we go through this, some of this may seem unnerving, and you may be a little bit uncomfortable as we talk about this liability that you have had. Please know that we at the Division of Drinking Water did not create this liability for you. You have been living with this for nearly 40 years. We just had a few public water systems that became uncomfortable with continuing to live with this and came to talk with us about solutions that we could do to help. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what your liability is, and then we'll talk about what we're trying to do to help and to alleviate that. And I really would love your feedback and your participation to let us know if we are hitting the right note, if it really is helpful, and if we've thought of all the things that you guys have thought about after we talked about this. So part of the liability that you have is what happens if infrastructure fails behind a master meter. So almost every community in this state has master meters that they serve to. Most of those cities and public water systems have considered that master meter to be the end of their system. And there are reasons for that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They consider that master meter to be the end of their system, but what happens when there's infrastructure that fails behind it? Particularly if there's a community water system behind that. So it's one thing if there's a transient or non-transient, non-community, but if there's a community water system that is behind that master meter, so that means 8 connections in the state of Utah or 25 people who are living behind that master meter, if that infrastructure fails, who's responsible to go fix that? Who's going to show up at 3 o'clock in the morning, because we all know that mainline breaks only happen at 3 o'clock in the morning. Who is going to show up and fix that? And who's going to pay for it, and who's going to respond? Now, there's a lot of situations that those residents think that they are part of your water system, and they assume that you're going to show up. And so it doesn't really go over really well when somebody calls you, the city, and says, I've got a main line break, and you say, actually, that pipe is not ours, you're behind a master meter, and so that's your responsibility, and Joe resident is then extremely frustrated and upset because he doesn't have a backhoe to go out and fix it, he doesn't have the equipment, he doesn't even know what he's doing, he just wants somebody to come fix the pipe that is a geyser in their front yard. So that's a liability. That's a problem that we have had for 40 years. What happens when that infrastructure fails? The next one is what would happen if there's a waterborne illness or a chronic type of thing that develops in that community behind that master meter. Who's going to be responsible for that? What if, for one reason or another, somebody takes a sample and we find that there's bacteriological issues behind that master meter, there's disinfection byproducts behind that master meter, there's increased levels of lead exposure behind that master meter. Who's responsible for that? That's a liability that you, as a municipality public water system, have been living with that liability. Now the other thing that you should be aware of is that the Division of Drinking Water only has authority over public water systems. So if there's no identified public water system behind that master meter, we can't do anything. We cannot go to a private property owner. We can't go to the developer that built that 10 years ago and hold them responsible and enforce anything on that. The only authority that we have is on public water systems. And yet it is our responsibility to make sure that everybody who is receiving water from a public water system is receiving the same protection, both from an infrastructure standpoint and from a water quality standpoint. So if one of these situations, the first two bullets were to occur, we then would have to take action. So what action would we take? Well, over the last couple of years, we've been looking into this, trying to decide what we would do in these situations, and we have run it past the Attorney General, and it has become clear that the only action that we could take that can be legally defensible is for us to go back to the public water system that is delivering the water to that community and hold them responsible. So if we had to take action, if somebody had to be held responsible and you were selling water to that master meter and nobody else had responsibility on the other side of the master meter, the only person that we can hold responsible is you. Now, we haven't done that in the past, but if I was ever pushed to that scenario, that's the only thing that I could do, because you are a public water system. There is a problem. We have a responsibility to resolve it, and you are the closest person that has custody over that, and so you're the one that we would have to go after because we don't have anybody else. So before this happens, we want to resolve this and kind of close this loophole, because I don't want to have to do that. You don't want me to have to do that to you. And so we want to talk about it. And the rest of this presentation is about trying to make this reality not as vulnerable and help cover your liability while we're still protecting public health. So as we go through this, as I talk through some of these items, if you get concerned, if you're worried as we hit any points, write that down. I absolutely want to hear the points of this solution that make you concerned, that you're worried about, and I want to talk about it. We're at a stage of this process that we can make adjustments, and so if your anxiety level goes through the roof on anything that we talk about over the next half hour or so, make a note of it and follow up either in this question answer time or follow up with me after. We want to hear about those things. So there is this concept called a contiguous development. This has been in the Division of Drinking Water rules for several years. This is not new, but I don't know that everybody is aware of it. A contiguous development means that if there is development happening and it's under the same ownership, and it's all part of the same community, that they're going to be considered all one public water system. What this was trying to protect against was allowing developers to come in and say, okay, if 8 connections makes me be a public water system, then I will come in and put 7 homes on one well, and then I'll drill another well and put 7 homes on that well, and then I'll do another 7 homes. So we're now up to 21 homes, 3 wells, and whether those systems are connected via pipes or not is not the point. So this contiguous development rule basically says, if you want to play that game, we're still going to consider you to have 21 connections, all of those people together, that's all one source, even if you have different pressure zones and one well goes to 7 homes and another well goes to another 7 homes, it's all one system. John?
Maureen, may I just interject here? We
Yeah.
heard from Laura Reefer of Salt Lake City. She was asking if they can respond in real time to your presentation. I'm advised if it's not coming through, they should type it into the message locator. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if they can't hear themselves talking for some reason, then
Okay.
if they type it in here, then I can relay it to you.
Okay.
Otherwise,
Okay.
they should be able to hear it.
So does Laura have a comment or question?
Laura, did you have a comment? Laura, if we can't pick you up by real time, could you please type in your question and we'll relay that to Marie? But thank you for that input. We'll try to get
Okay.
it corrected. Thank you.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's fine. The last thing on this contiguous development is that it was not intended to force large lots to be connected together. So we've had some questions that come back on the contiguous development, particularly in rural areas. If they have 5 to 10 acre lots that are separated out from each other, and they each have a separate well, and they were never, this doesn't force the consolidation of that into one whole system. We recognize that there are some water quality issues with having really long pipes with only 1 or 2 homes on them. So this contiguous development is not forcing that. It's just language that has been on the books for quite some time to avoid developers from gaming our system and just running right under the line of what a public water system is defined as. Okay. Guidance on determining population. As I mentioned before, we use 3.16 people per connection. That is from the Utah 2010 census. We will update that number when we have a 2020 census. So that's, whatever it is right now is what we use. So we are sticking with that number. We probably will have a new number from the 2020 census in about 4 years. And whatever that comes back at, that is what we'll use. We do have new language proposed in this rule that is giving guidance to how many people we consider for each campground or campsite. So if there's a campground that has 5 sites that people can come in and use, is that a public water system? We don't really know, like how many people go to a given campsite. We're tentatively kind of sitting at, most campsites don't allow any more than 8 people. So do we go with the average? Do we, you know, we're looking for some feedback on that. I don't know if you guys have any feedback on that. We might be reaching out to the Forest Service to kind of see what their average use of their campsites are. But we're kind of leaning towards somewhere around 6 people per campsite, just as guidance on how many people we will use per campsite. Now, both of these are rebuttable presumptions, so we're putting them in the rule that says, we're assuming this, and we're going to move forward with this. If for some reason you have credible information that these are not accurate for your situation, you can always come back and tell us. What you cannot do is say our average use or our average population shows that we have 3.2 or 3.0, and so, you know, you should let us have 9 connections. We're not going to go out and count. And if what you have now can change and your population can grow, we're not going to grant that. So you have to, it's rebuttable, you can come back, you can give us information, but it has to be something more than just a count of your current population. You have to show us that that population will never grow beyond that point. So, population. The next thing is we are proposing to add language into our rule that we pulled directly out of the federal act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. So this has always been true, we've just never had it in our state rule. So we've actually had a few situations where it was unclear whether the Division of Drinking Water had authority over federal lands, a public water system on federal lands. Now it is clear that we have always had that authority. The Federal Safe Drinking Water Act gives that to us. We're just going to pull that piece of language into our rule so that it's clear when people are reading through our rule that we already have it. This particular map shows the federal lands. So with the exception of those areas in pink, all of the solid colored lands are federal lands in the state of Utah. The Division of Drinking Water does not take primacy over Indian lands. In fact, the federal government has a unique way of dealing with those Indian lands. So the reservation lands and the Indian lands deal directly with the federal government. We have no jurisdiction over those at all. We can participate and help if requested, but we have no jurisdiction. Otherwise, every other solid block of land in this map is federal land, and we have authority over the public water systems that occur in those federal lands. So we want to clarify that and put it in our rule. The next thing that we want to clarify in the rules, so this is new language that we're proposing, is that we've already required for a public water system that they must designate a responsible person over the public water system. So they need to either give us an administrative contact or a responsible operator or both. Now that's always been the case. What is new is we are proposing language that says you cannot relinquish that custody over a public water system until somebody else takes it. So we've got this thing in the state of Utah and in many places of the country where, like, if there's a child that is dropped off, you can say, I relinquish custody of this child by dropping them off to a hospital, and the hospital will say, okay, we'll put them in the system. You can relinquish custody of a child, and that's a thing. That is not a thing for a public water system. There is no public water system that doesn't have a designated person that has custody over them. So once you take custody over part of a system or over an entire public water system, that custody is yours until somebody agrees to take it. And you can't step away from it. this is an important piece of what we're talking about a little bit later on. So somebody has to be responsible, and they can't just walk away. So a developer cannot take responsibility over the infrastructure or a development in lieu of you as a city and then walk away from that. They've got to either find somebody else who will take it or they continue to be responsible. So this is a new concept that we think will be helpful with the implementation of these new strategies. So why did we get ourselves in this situation where you have all this liability but you didn't realize that you did? EPA has created 5 categories that are off-ramps to the public water system definition. So if a community is considered, meets the definition of public water system, but they have no source of their own and they purchase it, they purchase all of their water, that could be one of the criteria that they can use for an off-ramp. Now the first 4 of these, you have to meet all of them. This last one is with airlines, and it's a unique situation. But if you have no source and you purchase all of your water, if you have less than 500 feet of distribution size piping, so that is more than your 1/4-inch pipe that goes to a home. Distribution size piping, less than 500 feet of that. If you have no significant treatment or storage, so you're not retreating the water in any way, and you don't have a tank, that you're a distribution tank that you're using, and you do not resell the water. If you meet all 4 of those, then EPA would let you take this little off-ramp and say, okay, you're not a public water system. So a lot of developers have been able to skirt into this loophole to say, I'm going to build 100 homes behind a master meter. I don't want to build up to the city's specs and standards because that's too expensive. And so I'm going to build it, but I'll put smaller pipe in than I need to so that it's not distribution size piping. And I'm not going to retreat it. I'm not going to have a tank to maintain pressure. And then this community is going to pay like community fees, so there's not an individual water bill. So we're not reselling. We're not reselling. Nobody's paying a water bill. So that's why we have gotten where we're at, where we have all of these little planned development units all over the state that are built behind master meters that don't have the same protections as the rest of your city does. So we are closing this off-ramp. EPA put those in, but we don't have to use them. It has created a whole lot of problem. I'm surprised at how often we have to have a discussion of what constitutes selling the water. And so we're closing that off-ramp. We're not using that anymore. It's no longer available. Now the other one with crossing state lines and airlines, we are not going to take over authority over the airlines. Federal government has that covered. So that's still a thing, and we're not going to worry about that. So we've created, instead of that off-ramp, this concept of a permit by rule. We're not the first of the state divisions to use this concept of permit by rule. We're adopting it. If you have dealt with the Division of Water Quality at all, this is a concept that they use, and we're modeling it after that. So permit by rule means you are regulated by us, you are a public water system, but you are not going to be regulated in the same way that everybody else is. So you meet the definition of a public water system, because otherwise we don't deal with you. So you meet the definition of a public water system, but you have low inherent risk. And because you have low inherent risk, we're going to deem that you are in full compliance unless we find evidence to the contrary. So, for instance, this apartment complex. This apartment complex is fed by the city. They have distribution pipeline, and they might even have 500 feet of it because they've got 2 different buildings there. But they have low inherent risk. They're not retrieving this water. They're delivering city water to that building, and that building was completely built up to code. There's no reason that we would think that there would be, after the fact, contamination of the water going into this system. And if there happened to be infrastructure failure, clearly the owner of that building is responsible to fix that. So it's low inherent risk. And so we're going to say that public water system is permitted by rule, and we're going to consider them in compliance unless we find for some reason that they're not, which could be a waterborne outbreak within that community. We can revoke that at any time. So if there happens to be a Legionella outbreak at this apartment complex, or say this is a nursing home, and there's a waterborne outbreak there, we can revoke that permit by rule status, and then we as a division of water can step in and regulate them like we would any other public water system. And then these can be revoked, but they can also be applied for. So we'll talk about how situations where you automatically have it, but if for some reason a situation comes up where we didn't think about it beforehand and put it in the rule, you can apply for permit by rule status. And if you happen to have lost it, you can always apply to get it back. So, what are some of the situations that give you permit rule by status? This should look just like, or very similar to the slide where EPA was giving off-ramps. So you have no source. All of the water is received from an existing approved public water system. A little bit more specific than the federal government had, but we felt like it was important. There are less than 500 feet of distribution size piping. No storage. We recognize and are proposing in the language that we will specifically call out fire storage, because we want to make sure that these larger buildings, which would constitute a permit by rule status, still maintains their appropriate fire storage facilities. And they do not have treatment or alter the physical or chemical properties. We are specifically calling out that traditional water softeners do not count as that. Water heaters will not count as that, even though it alters the physical property. But it wouldn't necessarily be exempted if a facility were to put corrosion control within their building, or they added treatment for Legionella within their building. So if those additional treatment facilities were put in place, that wouldn't be an automatic permit by rule situation. We are calling out regulated by facilities that are regulated by the Department of Agriculture, such as a drink dispenser. So most of you probably haven't even considered the fact that a drink dispenser is a public water system. But if there are 25 people that show up to fill their water bottle out of that drink dispenser, then it's a transient public water system, because there are people that are receiving drinking water from that. Now, we don't want to take over all of those. I have no interest at all in regulating every single soda pop machine. Those are regulated by the Department of Agriculture, so it's a specific thing that we are calling out and saying, those are regulated, those are permit by rule. Now, if there was a contamination and there was a problem, then we could step in and help by doing it this way. And then the last one is that it is a single building, and that building has been built up to the current plumbing code. So that's a lot of information. Do we have any questions, or anybody that?
Any questions coming in by chance? You have one here? You have one here?
Yeah.
You were clarifying as far as reselling water. HOA pays the bill, or pays the bill to the city, but then they pass the proportionate share to each homeowner. Is that reselling or not reselling?
So that's exactly the question that we've gotten over and over again, is that an HOA that whether they pass that bill on or not, that people are trying to get hung up with that. And frankly, we don't care. It's not on this list. It was on EPA's off-ramp list, but we closed that whole off-ramp, and now these are the things, and that is not on this list at all. If that HOA is delivering water to those people, I don't care how it's paid for. And so it's not on this list at all. If it's a public water system, then it's a public water system. Now, is that going to be permit by rule? If it's an apartment complex, it probably would be. If they are single homes and it's sprawled out, probably not. That probably wouldn't be considered a permit by rule.
Does each, you say single building, does that mean each building is a separate permit by rule? Even though it's all one development, all one apartment?
Not necessarily. If each single building is a permit by rule and we still consider it to be of a low risk, and they don't have 500 feet of distribution size piping, they could still be qualify under as a permit by rule.
All right, we've got 2 questions from folks online. The first is from Mark Stratford. He asks, if there is more than 500 feet of distribution sized pipeline, can a permit by rule status exist?
Yes, but it would have to be applied for.
Okay. And the second question is, would the changes be retroactive or proactive?
Well, that's a really good question, Mark, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
That's a really good question. I have a whole slide. Okay, anything else, and did I answer your, do you still have more?
So the point of all this is you're saying that a lot of these HOA permits will be defined as public water systems.
Yes.
And then Shane Jones asked, who is responsible for a permit by rule public water system?
So a permit by rule public water system, we would still want to have a contact person to have on record. But the way the draft language is written, that if a municipality serves water to a system that is by definition permit by rule, one of these automatic type of situations, and that changes. So if you're serving water to an apartment complex, it meets this definition, it's permit by rule, and then all of a sudden there's a waterborne outbreak. And I come in and say, okay, you're no longer permit by rule because you had an issue. You're clearly not low risk. The language in the rules specifies that because the delivery water system had a reasonable expectation that that was a permit by rule, they will not be held responsible for those fixes. Now, what are we going to do at that point? That becomes a difficult situation. I'm going to have to go find somebody. We're going to have to work through and make somebody responsible, and that becomes what we refer to as a welcome to the club letter, which is us just trying to make light of the fact that nobody likes entering our club. So we would send out that order that says, you are a public water system, and I, as a director, am asserting authority over you to regulate you because clearly you've got a problem. And so I am holding Joe Smith responsible because you are the current property owner or for whatever, and we go through that process. Our Attorney General vets who we can legally hold responsible, and we will go through that process. So the language, by creating these permit by rules definitions, it protects the water system that is serving these systems as permit by rule, that if that were to get revoked, it then doesn't fall back on you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, can you get your She has water.
I have water. Do you care water? It is tap water.
Do you need anything else?
On your, a lot of this hangs around definition sounds like for the population, right? Like if you have an HOA of less than 15 connections versus more than 15 connections, what is that?
8.
As far as
You just got to memorize 8. The federal government uses 15. In Utah, it's 8. 15 is not going to do very good. So 8 connections or 25 people.
So if there's less than 8 connections, what does that mean for the development versus more than 8 connections? As far as the reasonable expectation of a company.
Yes. I have another slide on that. We are addressing those in a new defined entity called a prospective system, and I've got a slide on that. So if I don't answer the question, ask it again when I get to there. Okay. Yes.
Another question from James Jones. How will a potential permit by rule system be?
They will not. Unless that's a comment that you're giving me, we are not anticipating we're going to reach out to all of them. We don't know who they are. You, as a public water system, can reach out to them and let them know, hey, by the way, just, we consider the master meter that serves your entire apartment complex to be the end of our line, and you have responsibility. So you could, as a water system, notify. We're not anticipating that we will do that. We will publicize this rule when we go through that process. There'll be a public comment period, but frankly, none of these people it's not going to be on the radar. They're not going to know it. And we don't have the ability to reach out and notify them. But if you have a suggestion or an idea, we'd love to hear that. If you need something from us to help facilitate that, let us know. Okay. Prospective water systems. I did anticipate that last slide would trigger this question. So this is a new concept in our rule. To identify a prospective water system. So we struggle a lot, and we have been struggling for a long time, with water systems that grow slowly. So they start out as one piece of property that great-grandpa had, and when he passed away, he gave it, his land then became jointly owned by his 3 children. So now instead of one property owner, we have 3 property owners. They're all using the water off of the same well. So great-grandpa had 1 cabin. Now all of the grandparents have 3 cabins. And then when they pass away, all of a sudden now that compounds to they each have 3 kids. Now we have 9. They all want to build on it. They all want to use the same well. The well's producing plenty of water. Everything seems great. These guys have been growing up for years drinking this water, and it's been wonderful. So we've got 9 cabins now, and all of these people want to bring up all of their kids. So on any given weekend, we have 150 people there, because I know how your families are. You have a family reunion, and there's 150 people there. And they're a public water system. But nobody along the line ever thought about that. They thought it was the family property. And all it takes is the first family member to try to sell their cabin off to somebody outside of the family, and that person say, wait a second, how's my water getting delivered? And then it gets flagged, it's a public water system. That well was never drilled up to specs. We have no idea what the screening depth is. It's not grouted. There's septic tanks all over the place. And so this public water system that just became a public water system is in a huge situation because they cannot bring their water system up to the code that they need to be in. So that's the example of one that happens. But those are difficult. Those were always going to be difficult. What we can prevent are those developers that just don't want to go through this process. And so they say, well, we know that 8 connections triggers us over to where we have to do a whole lot more, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to phase my development in 7 home phases. And so I'm going to build up to 7 homes, and then I don't have to build up to that, and then I'm going to walk away and let somebody else finish up this development. So I didn't have to build that well up to standard, and I'll make the next person come through and deal with it. So we've created this prospective water system. If your development looks like it's going to meet the public water system definition, as in you have it zoned or you've built a road to no houses whatsoever, but you can tell that it's been built for additional homes to be built, that's a prospective water system. And we're going to regulate you like a water system. When you drill your well, you have to submit the plans, and you have to have a 100-foot grout sill on that well, even if you're only building 3 homes initially. Because your intent, and it's very clear that that's going to grow beyond there. So before you build something that then can't be fixed to meet the regulations, we're going to assert enough authority over these public water systems that they have to meet the source approval. So they have to develop a source that's not contaminated, that people can actually drink. They have to have infrastructure plan approval. They have to submit plans to us so that we can make sure that those wells and those intake structures and these springs are built according to the standards. They need to have a capacity review. What other people think is enough water is not always enough water. And we do that, so they have to go through a capacity review. They are subject to sanitary surveys. That is our audit process. We show up and we inspect. That's a sanitary survey. And a prospective system, we are just putting in the rule that we can show up and inspect that and make sure that we're doing what they need to be doing. But these are systems that are small, and they are not technically a public water system yet. So we will not require any sampling of them until they actually cross the threshold to be a public water system. So this is the proposal that we put together. We would really like your feedback of whether this is going to work for you or not. We're trying to help you as a public water system to not get stuck with poorly built infrastructure that all of a sudden becomes your responsibility. So the rule says that these prospective water systems are required to self-report to us. So if we find one that we didn't know about, it's not your responsibility. They were supposed to call us and let us know. That responsibility comes back on them. So if they're developing, they need to contact us. And we also added language in the proposed rule that says land use authorities should not issue building permits without documentation that these prospective water systems have contacted us. Now, you might also be the land use authority. You might be a city that's a public water system and a land use authority. And if that's the case, you can keep track of that. So you know who's asking to connect, and then you can say, well, okay, the next office down is my building permit office, and so if they don't have a letter from the Division of Drinking Water that says that the Division of Drinking Water is aware of them as a prospective system, then we can't issue a building permit. You could do that for them. When they submit that, you could call and let us know, and we can work through the process and just put them in the database and give you whatever documentation that ends up being. So you can choose to do that for them, but the rule specifies it's their responsibility. If you choose to do that for them, it's just you being nice. The responsibility lies within them to self-report to us if they're a prospective public water system.
Yeah, I just that
Yes.
responsibility or whatever means for them to
Develop.
follow these, is that correct?
Yes.
So is that rule doesn't exist now? When will that exist? Because if I go with also with building permit, since we adopted the rule, they're gonna, sue me.
Right, yeah. That's part of the feedback that we would really love from you. We want want you to consider what we've put together, and we would like your feedback of when you want this implemented. So our draft language that we have, and have we shared that with you, John?
I have not seen that.
We will get that, and you can send it out to your to all of your members. There are a couple of just blank spots in this rule language. One of them is all of these highlighted areas. Implementation date. We don't know what that is. We'd like that too. And then there's a couple of other things like the population.
Oh my God.
This would be an update to section 309 of the state code.
Yes. Yep. Section 309, 100, and 105, I think, are the two rules that it's. Okay. Any other questions on this so far?
Just to clarify the status currently versus when this gets adopted. Are you stating that they are currently still identified as public water systems because they serve 8 or more connections, but they don't have this permit by rule, or they're not public water systems until the update is done?
No, they are public water systems now. They meet the definition of a public water system now. That definition has been in place for 40 years. We don't have the mechanism until this passes to have a permit by rule. So they are a public water system. They are, they have the right to have their water regulated as a public water system. So if there is a problem now before this passes and we have to take action, the only thing we can spend in action is to come back to you and say, you are the public water system. And that's what we're trying to do.
I thought you just said that they're identified as a public water system currently.
So their definition of a public water system, we don't have them on record. So we have nobody to regulate. So if there's a mainline break, or if there is a water quality issue, they meet the definition of a public water system, but you're the one that's been delivering water to them. So we have nobody to take enforcement action on except for you.
And you envision like the HOA being that entity or the building manager being that entity?
Oh, I hope not. But probably. That's after we pass this, if they are a permit by rule, for some reason that falls, and that gets revoked for one reason or another, that's who we would be looking for is a building owner, or you know, if the HOA has become a legal entity, like they've incorporated, that becomes something that we can work with. But none of these people, when those situations arise, are prepared to become a public water system. They have no idea what that entails, and they're not ready to take that on.
And I know it's kind of semantics, but they're not becoming a water system. They're already a public water system. They're just becoming a compliant water system.
Right now, they're your public water system. So just the fact that they've been hidden behind the master meter has not protected you from the fact that you are liable. They are part of your public water system. We're trying to create a way so that you know what you've taken on and what you haven't, and there's an ability for somebody else to take responsibility for it. But right now, they're part of your public water system. That master meter does not create any protection for you.
So it sounds like what you're saying is you would not define them as a public water system until it passes.
Correct.
And Mark asked, if a developer behind a master meter fails to register with the Division of Drinking Water and there is a later problem, then I take it that DDW will look to the city to be responsible for the infrastructure behind the master meter.
Will you read that again?
If the developer behind a master meter fails to register with the Division of Drinking Water and there's a problem, then I take that DDW will look to the city to be responsible to the infrastructure behind the meter.
If that development behind the master meter is defined as a public water system and does not meet the permit by rule, yes, we would come back to the city, unless they had something else in place for that, which again is another slide. So they have to meet the definition of the public water system and not meet the definition of the permit by rule, and then yes, we would.
And just to clarify then, if those groups that are behind a master meter that have less than 8 connections, they would continue to be not defined as a public water system. It would be the responsibility of the city, even when the master meter are.
So once this rule passes, they would be a prospective water system?
Only if there's anticipation that it would grow.
Right, yeah. And there are going to be times that you don't anticipate, but it does anyway. And we will continue to deal with those the way we always have dealt with those. But if they have less than 8 connections behind a master meter, they're considered a prospective water system, which means that you as a city should be aware of them and you should decide how you're going to interact with them as soon as they cross that threshold. Are you going to take them over? Are you going to have them be their own independent public water system? So this protects you because then you are aware of them and you can anticipate how you want to interact with them. And that is really completely at your control.
And if they don't meet the definition approved by rule, because let's say they have sufficient distribution pipe more than 500 feet, then what I heard you say was the city can still enforce with liability roads or something to get them to get by permit. They're not automatic. You don't have. You can not meet one of those criteria and still get them by rule if there's an application.
If there's an application, yeah.
For a public water system.
Yeah. And
We get to make that determination whether they're.
so they would make that application of us, and if you as a servicing provider want to be aware of those and be able to comment on those, we can absolutely facilitate that. If you want to be part of that, we can facilitate. We hadn't considered that.
I'm envisioning a large apartment complex with a master meter could easily have more than 500 feet of distribution piping.
Yes. And then they could apply.
What if they don't want? Does that have something to do with its own land development code to require that?
Well, if they don't want to, and as we go further, those are existing ones. You can continue to live with the liability that you've already been living with for 40 years. That's a possibility. If they don't want to do that, you can encourage them to do that by putting that requirement in their contract for water. You can encourage them in other ways and using other tools that you have. You can continue to live with it. Again, that's within your control to decide what you want to do with it.
What was the reason why 500 feet of distribution size pipe was chosen?
That has been in our rule for quite a while. We talked about it for probably a year and a half or so to see if there was a better number, and we didn't come up with a better number, so we stuck with what we have been doing for forever. Where that number originally came from, I don't know. I can't speak to that. But we did not get any feedback, or we were not able to determine a number that was better. But if you happen to know of one, we would love to hear about that.
One last question, sorry. Is the preference that once you grow beyond that size, you want them to go through the more formal process, not be, I guess you're trying to think of a larger system that doesn't have their own source. You're saying at some point we don't want you to be exception by rule, we want you to be a formal application. Is that the logic there?
The logic there is if they are a large enough system, you need to know what they've got behind there. And somebody's got to take responsibility. So if they've got more than 500 feet of distribution pipeline, that's 500 feet of pipeline that somebody has to repair if it fails. So is that going to be you or is that them? Somebody has to know that. And whomever that is going to be should be aware of that before that main line breaks, that it's their responsibility. So the idea is just to recognize that there is liability and who is going to be responsible for it. Yeah.
So Laura Briefer from Salt Lake asks, in situations where the land use authority is different than the city providing the water, where does the liability fall if the land use authority issues the building permit incorrectly?
It's a good question. So we would put in the rule that they should not. But since we can't actually regulate a land use authority, I am not certain the answer to that, Laura. Our intent was to create some protection by actually identifying that they shouldn't. And therefore, if that ended up in court or something, that there would be a state rule that said, look, you're supposed to do this. But would we file that case against them? Probably not. Would we be able to come and speak to our rules and why that was in there? Yes. So I'm not exactly certain, but if you and your team, Laura, have, the intent was to give that direction, to kind of hold them responsible, but we don't regulate them. So there's very little we can do, but if you've got a recommendation, I'd love to hear that.
And then we have another question. How can we get a list of public water suppliers that are registered in our area if we know of some that should we report them to DPW, and will this reduce the city's liability?
Possibly, but my last couple of slides kind of gives you some strategies to move forward with. We do have a list of all of the public water systems that we have on record with the state. You can go search that in waterlink.utah.gov, waterlink.utah.gov, and you can search. We have all public water systems have a 5-digit number, and the first 2 digits are by county, so you can search for all of the water systems within your county, and then you kind of have to narrow it down and look further. We also have a new tool on our website where you can get on and type in your address or any address, and it will come up and say, this address is being served by this public water system. So we modeled it after your voter registration, where you can type in your address and it tells you what district you're in and who your representatives are and whatnot. So we use that. You can type in an address and it says your water is being delivered by this public water system. And then it takes you directly to their Waterlink page and shows you who they are, and who their administrative contacts are, and if they're a big system or a low system, and if they're approved or not. So we have this new tool that could also be helpful for that, but you would need a distinct address to be able to use that one. Any other questions?
That's also fine.
Okay, how are we doing on time, John? Do you want me to keep going?
You're looking at about 2:08 p.m.
I'm okay. Do you want me to keep
okay?
going?
If you said you have several more to go, 2 more?
4 more slides.
Marie,
Probably.
Okay.
Yes.
before you leave this, you're talking here, I think, about systems that are behind the master meter. Does the same
Nope.
thing?
This is all prospective water systems.
So this is, okay, so it's not, this is,
This could be behind a master meter.
but not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
It can just be a little development out there all by itself.
Yep, because we recognize that those are still a problem. And
Yeah,
Kurt,
absolutely.
you've been working with us on those a lot around the state. And so this is a new section of the rule that is not limited to behind a master meter, but it is applicable to behind a master meter in some situations.
So for those that's not behind the master meter, then the authority would be the county.
The building authority?
Yeah.
Yes, yep. And that's why we didn't specifically say the city. can't issue that, because it could be a county that's issuing that building. Okay. And, okay, so future bulk meters. Going forward, one, we don't know what the implementation date of this is. We would like your feedback. When you feel like this is ready and you want to have these protections in place, we kind of want to know what your preferred implementation schedule would be. Future bulk meters. A public water system supplying the water accepts all responsibility for the infrastructure behind a bulk meter unless, now this is future, this is not past. The receiving system is not a PWS by definition. Okay, so you can put a master meter in to an industrial site that does not count as a public water system and you're just fine. They just need extra water. Maybe they're a really large computer spy center that the federal government built somewhere in the state. If that were to happen, they're not by definition a public water system. It's okay, they can have a really big meter just because they need it. Or the receiving system is permitted by rule. They're one of those automatic permitted by rule. Or they're an independent public water system. So new bulk meters going in from whatever implementation date that we end up using. From that point forward, public water systems will be responsible for the infrastructure unless they meet one of these three criteria. That's what our proposal is. What this allows you to do as a public water system is say, developer, you have to meet our standards or you have to become your own public water system. You are no longer allowed to build and connect onto our water system, even through a master meter or a bulk meter, unless you meet our standards, unless you become your very own public water system. So if you don't meet our standards, great, you go to the state, you can meet their standards. And that's what that does for you whenever that date happens. Okay? Now, this doesn't address all of the existing ones. The existing ones are already there. The existing ones will have the permit by rule in place, and as those situations arise, we will have to deal with those. So we have tried to create some guidance on what that's going to look like so that you guys are not in the dark. So existing bulk meters, how are we going to define where the terminus of your water system is? So the natural definition will be the residential meter, not the bulk meter, where the residential meter would be. So if you have a bulk meter out on the main street, but you've got 100 homes behind that, those residents have the reasonable expectation that there would have been a meter in their property line like everybody else. So that's going to be not where the bulk meter is, but where the residential meter is reasonably expected to have been placed. So that's usually the property line. So we did the residential meter, the property line, or at the director's discretion. Now I get that this can be really scary because basically that's saying, whatever I decide, and what if I have a really crappy day? And I just am mad and I just want to just hand it out to you and make you be liable. First of all, my responsibility is to never have a really crappy day to make decisions like that on you guys. But what I will consider, and this is in the rule language, in making those determinations is, do you have a legal agreement that says otherwise? Do you have a legal agreement with that entity that says, yes, your meter is here or your property line is here, but we both agreed that you're going to take responsibility for this pipe? Good enough for me. You agreed, it's fine. Historic understandings, if you can provide documentation, or they can provide documentation, that there is a historical understanding and you have been implementing based on that, I can take that into consideration. Billing practices. If you are receiving a bill directly from those residents, even if they're behind a master meter, you know, they kind of have a reasonable expectation that you're their provider and that you have taken responsibility all the way to their property line and to their meter. So we'll consider that. And public health protection, which is what we always stick in. If there is some particular reason why this needs to be determined that way in order to protect all the children behind there, we always have that caveat to make decisions based on public health concerns and what needs to be there. So questions on this? This is just guidance for how we would deal with problems that came up on existing bulk meters as they come up. We do not have time to go chasing all of these. Now, if you as a public water system want a determination on this after we do this, you could always bring that information to us and we could work through this. But our intent is not to go looking for this. Our intent of this section of the proposed rule is to give you guidance on what we would do if there was a problem.
This would be if they do not qualify for permit by rule? Because if they're permit
Yes.
by rule, then
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. But if, again, we're not going to go looking for them. So if they came to our attention because there was an issue that happened, then all of a sudden they're not qualified for permit by rule because they're not low risk anymore. So if this came to our attention because there was a Legionella outbreak at a hospital, that hospital is not considered low risk and therefore applicable to a permit by rule.
But they were applicable up until that incident.
Correct. Okay. So, what do I recommend next for you and for me? If you have existing bulk meters, you can either continue to live with the existing liability for historic bulk meters as you have done for the last 40 years. If you're comfortable with it, and all of this sounds like we're making a big deal over nothing and you really aren't that worried, fine, that's okay. You can continue on that mode, it's just fine. And some communities, it's probably will continue to be just fine. If you're a small community and you know exactly what's going on and where, that might be your best option. I just want you to be aware of that and you can make your own decision. Or you can identify all of the existing master meters and establish contracts if necessary. If you are worried that something might happen down the road, enter into a contract with whomever it is that's paying the bill and say where their responsibility is and where your responsibility is and have that contract on record. Those are two options that you can take for your existing master meters and bulk meters. For future bulk meters, and again, I don't know where that date is of what's existing and what's future. Would love your feedback on that. But you could either continue to allow future bulk meter installation just as they have done. I recommend that you make them build up to your standards because you now will be accepting their infrastructure as part of your own. So I recommend that you hold them responsible to building up to your standard if you continue to do that. Or you identify who is responsible as an independent public water system. And then we are asking that you participate in this process with us now, because for us, after we go through this process, our next step is to submit proposed rule language to EPA for a primacy review. Once we have done that, it is extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible, for us to change the rule based on your comments. So we want to get all of your feedback and your comments before we give it to EPA, so when they do a primacy review us, then we can come back, implement whatever changes they want, and then we start the official rulemaking process where it goes to public comment. So this is not how we've usually done rule changes, but we'd like to do it differently, and we think that this is a big enough deal to you and your membership and to your cities that we would like you to engage with it now. We were hoping that we could, in 2019, preferably the beginning of 2019, have some rule language that we could submit to EPA for primacy review. If we find that you need some more time and we need to go through more stakeholder and we need to revamp this, we would rather do it right rather than meet that schedule. But I also want to hear back from you guys how anxious you are to get this implemented. And if you're looking for it sooner rather than later, know that even if we were ready to submit this to EPA today, we're probably talking at least 6 months before we could have an implementation date. Just based on the process that goes through, we pretty much have to give EPA 3 months to do their primacy. So with that, if we've got any other questions, I'm happy to do that. And then I have one last reminder before we're done.
Marie, can I just, for our people, for our members, and any others listening, the way to open dialogue with you is listed here. Is that correct? To contact Nicole Smith and submit those as listed there. Is that the way we, in the future, participate with questions coming out of
Yes.
this exercise?
Yeah, and it'd be great if the league would be interested, if there's enough to kind of consolidate comments. That could be helpful for us. But yeah, Colt is going to be the one that collects all of these comments, and Colt and I and our team will be working on trying to address those concerns and giving feedback. We are currently working on, but we don't have it yet, an online method to submit comments to this, as well as a variety of other things that we have going on. We don't have that quite ready to roll out yet, but it might be before this whole process is ready. But right now, this is, Colt is the best way to get information to us. Any other questions? Okay, just a reminder before we're done. This has nothing to do with what we've been talking about, but water use data reporting requirements are due March 1st, 2019. So if you have not got on to look at what your new requirements are for submitting data, I recommend you do that sooner rather than later. The new system-specific sizing determination for every public water system that serves more than 3,300 people is also due by March 1st. And if you go to our website, this is our landings, our homepage of our website looks like. And the box in red, it won't be red when you get there, but look there. We have a whole website there that provides some guidance documents, a bunch of information, and in the next day or two, we will have the first of 2 YouTube videos to talk public water systems through our implementation and how to go about and our resources. So if you get on YouTube and search for the Utah Division of Drinking Water, you'll see a whole list of our YouTube videos. You ought to watch any ones that you find interesting. But within the next day or two, you will see the first of 2 that talks about this, and then there'll be a second one next, probably a month later to finish that up. But just didn't want March 1st to blindside anybody.
On the previous topic, is there a draft of the rules to review, or is this presentation?
We do have a draft, and I will share that with John, and we can get it out to everybody.
I'm guessing if we comment on the specific text.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at the specific text. This was all just a summary of it.
that gonna go on your website or just available through the league?
We can, oh, excuse me.
And this presentation as well?
We have not decided when we're gonna put it on our website, so it's going to be just through the league for now. But we will share it with anybody who wants to,
You
but
share the presentation on the draft?
yeah, absolutely.
And we can put the presentation on our website.
Yeah, there's benefits to being in the league. You're getting the low language. Soon.
Well, Marie, I really appreciate very much you taking the time, the detail to go through this. It was not a Halloween surprise.
Is it scary?
No, it's scary.
It is
No.
scary.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. We appreciate it. And again, we will be continuing to have materials available and information available